War of the Worlds, Goliath. This is a disappointing use of 3D. Last week, I praised the Peanuts cartoon for its intelligent use of mixing comic book style art within a stereo image. This movie does the same thing, poorly. We have hand-drawn animation with all sorts of little shortcuts and as minimal amount of drawing as possible. And it's always shown just as a cutout against the background, which is often flat. For too much of the movie, all you had were two layers. Now, I don't mind a cartoon being a cutout, which is often what the old Viewmaster reels gave us. That is a legitimate style, and it can be very entertaining. Frankly, I wish they made more of them. However, it still needs a little work, a little finesse to get it right. It needs a lot of cutouts. It needs to give each element an appropriate space. The Charlie Brown movie got away with this largely because the characters were shaded in a way consistent with the surroundings. Here, everything is high contrast, so it's glaringly separate from the background, which again in Peanuts, that background had some finesse to it, multiple stereo elements. Here, the background is never more than a matte. No attempt is made to give it even a rudimentary sense of dimension. We should at least see the skies further from the buildings or separate the furniture from the wall. There's also a lazy attempt to get the depth right. For example, these explosions are clearly in front of and not connected to the building that they are supposed to emanate from. It feels so cheap and rushed. Realistic snow, dust, sunbeams, and fog are occasionally layered on top of it all. This is rendered in acceptable stereo and is frankly very pretty when it's present. But I also think it sets up an expectation that CGI will be in stereo. The enemy robots and some ships are computer models rendered in a line art style. However, they are animated also in a smooth CGI style, which makes them contrast the hand-drawn characters. I tended to focus on the robots and found myself straining a bit to try and pick up on the stereo I instinctively assumed was there because they were flowing so smoothly, but it wasn't. They're flat as well, save for perhaps the occasional blast or arm reach. This could have been a very interesting 3D experience if they separated out more elements, gave it some more depth overall, and rendered the CGI portions in actual stereo, or at least converted it to some extent. Instead, it just feels unsatisfying, warm but undercooked. Now, this was 2012 when the new era of 3D was still finding its footing, but this just doesn't strike me as difficult territory, even for then. Story-wise, it has an interesting premise. It extends the War of the Worlds into a bit of a steampunk version of the early 1900s, with a president who personally leads the army into battle with a charming excess of bravado. As I understand, they made a small franchise out of this idea, and this was produced by Kevin Eastman, one of the co-creators of the Ninja Turtles, and seeing his name at the start of the credits elevated my expectations. I watched it with a friend who is well-versed in the comic book world. He remarked that the battle scenes were comparable to watching kids play with toys. No complexity or strategy, just stop and shoot and react. Myself, it reminded me of old 80s and 90s TV cartoons like the Transformers and G.I. Joe. It was just interesting enough to keep me watching for its runtime. There was some personality to the characters, but they really weren't given anything that made use of their personas, which, much like the 3D, made it all a bit frustrating because I kept expecting it to get better, to really hook me in. There was a feeling of potential here that I just kept hoping would materialize, but like the Charlie Brown and the Great Pumpkin, it just never arrived.